I'm waiting for an okay from our moderator. Okay, so recording started now. So good morning. I'm Bethany Wilkes, and I'm the Information Literacy Librarian here at Egan Library at University of Alaska Southeast in Juneau. And I want to thank you all for coming to this webinar this morning. I've been pretty excited about it, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some general tips for engaging learners in different teaching and learning activities. And it looks like we have a nice small-sized group here. And so I also look forward to some discussion about the different learning strategies that you use as well to engage learners. So as I go along with the webinar today, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have, either by using the chat function or just asking. Okay, so I see that someone is having a problem with the audio. Cheryl? And can you do me a favor, the rest of you, and just raise your hands one more time if you can hear me okay? Okay, thanks, Shar. Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Melinda. Okay, and Eric, can you hear me okay? Hi, Freya. Okay, so Julie, maybe you can help Cheryl out with the audio if possible, and I'm going to go ahead and continue on. And so let's see. Here we go. So before we get moving along with the webinar, I'd just like to take a quick poll using the polling feature. And if you could let me and the others know if you usually teach online or face-to-face. So A would be online, B face-to-face, C, I don't have teaching responsibilities, and D, other. So let's have a look at what folks have going on if you're primarily teaching online or face-to-face. And I'll put the responses here. Okay, so it looks like most people actually have, okay, so most people teach online, and then we have a few people who haven't responded yet. So if you could use the polling feature up in the left-hand side of the program and just give me an idea of where your teaching responsibilities mainly take place. So the way to respond should be in the upper left-hand corner where you see the emoticons and then the option to step away from a session, also raise hand, and then you can respond to the poll with the icon on the right. Okay, so let me display this again. Okay, awesome. So it looks like most people generally teach online with a couple face-to-face, and then a couple or one person with other teaching responsibilities. So, okay, I'm hearing my audio sounds odd. Okay, is that better? Okay, thanks for letting me know. Oh, that's awesome. We have an instructional designer with us, so that is really great. Okay, so actually I primarily teach face-to-face. You might be able to tell that already, but I do have some online teaching responsibilities as well, and those are actually mostly asynchronous. But today I've tried to incorporate into this session some tips and techniques that will apply to both teaching online and into the face-to-face environments. But it's really helpful to know what type of environment to emphasize a bit more. So today what I would like to cover is why engagement is important. So why are we taking the time today to really talk about engaging learners? And I'm also going to talk about some specific ways to facilitate engagement when you are both developing and delivering teaching and learning activities. So now engaging learners is a pretty general topic, but my hope is that by the end of the session you'll have a few specific ideas on how to increase engagement with your teaching and learning activities as a result of our time together today. And so by the end of the webinar, I hope that you'll be able to recognize ways in which to integrate active learning techniques into your own teaching and learning activities, and hopefully identify at least one specific activity that facilitates engagement that you will use with a future teaching and learning activity. And I really look forward to talking with you and discussing a couple of different activities that we can all use, I think, to increase engagement in our learning environments. So first of all, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to think about why we want to engage our learners. So why are we here today spending the time to talk about engagement? Well, one primary reason to consciously work to engage learners is to increase learner motivation. So I think we've all noticed that when students feel like they're actually contributing to and truly participating in an activity, they're generally going to feel more motivated because they need to contribute to that activity in order to really make it a success for the whole class or workshop, whatever the learning activity and the environment might be. Additionally, participants in our activities are most likely going to draw on a range of learning styles. And I really believe that through fostering engagement, you can improve your chances of appealing to different learning styles as well. And frankly, it's just more fun for all involved, I believe, to contribute to an environment in both which the participants and the teacher are actively engaged. I found a nice quote from the University of Washington Center for Teaching and Learning, and I think it does a really great job at articulating the need for engaging students. So it states on its webpage, research has demonstrated that engaging students in the learning process increases their attention and focus, motivates them to practice higher level thinking skills, and promotes meaningful learning experiences. And I think that we are probably all after those meaningful learning experiences as we work with different types of learners and in different environments as well. So I'm just going to throw a question out there and you can respond, I guess, using the microphone or the chat box. And I'd just like to get your ideas on why you think engaging students is important, or engaging your learners, whoever they might be. And I can see a couple of you are typing into the chat box, so that's great. Okay, Shar, thank you. Yes, to keep attention. You can definitely tell when learners are not engaged, right? And I see a couple of other responses coming in. Okay, and so it increases active listening, which helps learn, and they retain the information longer. That's great. Yes, and it helps you gauge their understanding. By engaging learners in a variety of active learning techniques in particular, or active learning activities, you can actually kind of assess what's going on with the class and gauge their understanding, like Julie just mentioned, as you go through the particular learning activity. So great, those are really some great contributions as to why it's important to foster engagement with your learners. Okay, so now I'd like to move a little bit into the components of actively thinking about facilitating engagement while you are planning, developing, and delivering your learning activity. So it's important to consider and integrate ways in which to facilitate engagement into both the development and the delivery of a learning activity. So it's definitely worth taking the time to really plan and organize your teaching and learning activity. So your session, your workshop, whatever that activity might be. So it's really worth the time that you take to sit down and seriously plan and organize the session. When you're developing your activity, of course it's important to think carefully about the learning outcomes and state them clearly. This can really help guide the development of your activity. Learning outcomes are really emphasized in academic libraries, as I'm sure you know, and have been for some time. And they can really help frame workshops for a variety of teaching activities and in different environments as well. I really think that they are a great way to begin to plan what you will cover as part of a session, and then to go along, particularly with engagement, they can help you think about how to get learners involved in a particular activity to ensure that you will help the learners meet the learning outcomes of a particular session. So I don't want to talk too much about developing learning outcomes, but I just want to make sure to mention them and how they can really help you frame your session, and how they can also provide kind of guidelines to use in order to develop the particular ways in which you will facilitate engagement as part of your session. So that you might already know that using Bloom's taxonomy as a guide for developing learning outcomes is a good way to develop them and to make them specific. And I think it's really important that you do state your learning outcomes clearly, because after all, they really spell out what your participants are expected and should be able to do after your learning activity. And then by doing this, by creating the learning outcomes, as I mentioned just a minute ago, you can also begin to think about what types of active learning techniques, what types of activities you will use as part of your learning activity to help learners actually reach those learning outcomes. So this goes into how will you actually get your learners to meet the learning outcomes. So this is what we strive to do, right? As part of our teaching and learning activities, we want to ensure that learners will be able to meet and achieve the learning outcomes of our particular teaching and learning activities. So once you've actually stated your learning outcomes in the development of your learning activity, consider how you will equip learners to meet those learning outcomes. So this is where the engagement and the planning for engagement can really come in. So here you can think about the organization and timing of your activity, what active learning techniques you will use. So active learning techniques are really great for promoting and fostering engagement, and I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about those and hearing from you about those as well. And also what you will strive for in your teaching style. So all of these different aspects of your sessions contribute to helping your learners achieve and meet the learning outcomes of the session. And also all of these aspects of your activity can foster engagement with your students and amongst your students with the material as well. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about planning your activity and timing. So I'm sure that you all have experiences with conducting particular learning activities and the challenges sometimes of timing, how to allow for a certain amount of time for different activities that you want to take place during your session, how long to allow for discussion, how long to spend on covering a particular topic, how long will your entire session take, at what points will learners break into groups, work on an exercise, or share what they have learned. So when planning your activity, it's really important to take timing into consideration. And it seems that timing can really impact the interest and engagement of learners. So somebody mentioned earlier about keeping students' attention, right? So keeping the attention of our learners is oftentimes a challenge, and by let's say manipulating, I guess, or by paying attention to, maybe manipulating is a strong word, but paying attention to the timing of different aspects of your session, you can work to actively keep your learners involved and pay attention to them as well to see if they have any if their interest is waning in your particular session. And this waning interest, of course, generally calls for a new activity or at least a change up in delivery pace and or interaction. So I've actually read recently that some educators even suggest changing up activities every 15 minutes. So that might be something you might want to try in one of your learning activities or workshops. You might also consider placing active learning opportunities at intervals of the activity. I know a lot of us maybe started out teaching by lecturing or having group discussion and then having more of the active learning activity, hands-on practice at the end of the session. Well, breaking that up into having those activities during different parts of an instruction session of a workshop is often helpful in keeping learners engaged. So it's definitely essential when you are planning to aim for a certain time frame, and as I've been saying, thinking about the certain amount of time to allot for different activities and aspects that are part of your particular session. So at the same time, though, you'll find that you actually need to be flexible with both the timing and the pacing of the class. So when you're actually teaching a class, this seems pretty common sense, but I've actually run into the problem myself where I do not have a clock or a watch handy. So make sure that you have a timepiece handy and that you can actually see it. And you might not want to be checking your watch all the time to check on the timing of a session if you are in a face-to-face environment in particular. So you might also want to ask someone you know to flag you down at certain intervals of your learning activity to help keep you on task, just to guide you through the certain sections of your activity. And it's important, like I mentioned earlier, to remember that you might have to change your plans and be flexible if aspects of your activity take a shorter or longer amount of time than you planned. So on one hand, I think it's really important to be structured when you're planning your activity in terms of how much time to allot for each part of it. But then on the other hand, you also need to be responsive to the learners and flexible as well. So dealing with timing, I think, can actually be quite challenging, but if you're able to manage it effectively, it can really contribute to a more engaged environment. Okay, so are there any comments about timing? Does anybody want to share any challenges that they have had with timing or any effective ways that they have used to manage timing in their learning activities? And you can use the chat box, or I think you can also use the microphone as well. Okay, so generally speaking, just by a show of hands, is managing the timing of your learning activities pretty easy for you? Do you find that to be pretty simple? Okay, and does anybody find it to be, excellent, thank you. So I see a comment now, you can use body language to help you determine when to change up an activity. Yes, definitely. Recently, I had a student in one of my workshops who was basically stretching and groaning out loud about halfway through our workshops. So then I took it upon myself to try to engage him a little bit more actively, and he was responsible for coming up with the examples that we would use for some of our database searches for the rest of the workshop, and that really promoted his engagement and that of the other students as well. Yes, Kathleen, I agree with you. I have a harder time managing time online as well. And yes, the too much talking, time does get away. Okay, yes, and then practicing the presentation definitely will help. Yes, Freya, I share that challenge that you just noted, and I'm worried that I might be doing it a little bit with our webinar right now. And thank you, Eric. Yes, I agree. Silence can be positive or negative. It's difficult sometimes to, or at least for me, to kind of determine how long to wait when there is silence before kind of jumping in to respond with the answer to a question or comment to try to promote further discussion. So silence, yes, can elicit discussion. On the other hand, it can lose students if there's no focus. So great, thanks very much for your comments there on timing. So next I'm going to move into talking a little bit about active learning techniques. And I'm going to highlight a few active learning techniques as ways, of course, to facilitate engagement. And really, active learning techniques can range from something as simple as a poll or a pretest to a structured group activity to simply asking questions and providing opportunities for group discussion. So the active learning techniques that are incorporated into a particular learning activity should complement the learning outcomes. So they shouldn't just be some type of bells and whistles to get learners' attention, although those might be good for a wake up from time to time. But the active learning techniques should really support the learning outcomes of the learning activity. So active learning techniques, and as I mentioned earlier, should appeal to different types of learners. So it's important to remember that some participants won't always be comfortable sharing their opinions or questions with the rest of the class, and they actually might not learn best that way either. So if you can try to include individual activities as well as group activities and activities that require silence, like Eric just mentioned, can be positive or negative, then you'll have a better chance of reaching learners with multiple learning styles. So just keep in mind that sometimes activities such as a 1-minute paper, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, or even discussion in pairs before presenting to the rest of the class are simple ways to meet the needs of learners who might be more introverted, because we certainly don't want them to get lost amidst all the excitement of discussion and students who are more willing and interested to freely contribute to learning activities. So the first learning activity that I want to talk a little bit about is the basic poll. And now for the following examples, I've tried to select techniques to discuss that are fairly easy to integrate into sessions, can be applied to a variety of context and delivery formats, and that we have used here at UAS as part of different learning activities. So first of all, like I mentioned, here we have some information about polls. So I really love conducting polls as part of learning activities. And a poll is super simple. How many of you remember having to raise your hands in class to show if you understand a particular concept or to choose A, B, or C? So if you remember raising your hand as a student, if you could just raise your hand now, that would be great. So polls are really old school, right? There's nothing new about taking a poll. Thank you. But when you do take a poll, there are actually different ways in which you can do that. Taking a poll is actually really helpful in order to encourage interaction, and it can also give you a better understanding of how to frame or target your activity. So there's a good old show of hands for taking polls. Also, you can have learners respond with flashcards or numbers. So learners could, if you're in the face-to-face environment, respond with a flashcard of different colors in response to a question, or also numbers showing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on a show of hands. You can also pick an option online through like an online survey. Also paper ballots. Paper ballots are nice to use in face-to-face environments to begin to develop an understanding sometimes of what, or begin to understand what learners, what experiences they might have coming into a workshop. It's nice to do with paper ballots, so that's a little more anonymous. And there's also a technology called Poll Everywhere that I've just began to use recently. And let's see another show of hands, please, to see if anyone has used Poll Everywhere. Aha, so a couple of people, yes. I think it was Eric and Kathleen who said yes, they've used Poll Everywhere. Do you want to share any of your observations about working with Poll Everywhere?
We used it. This is Kathleen. We used it in one of our book discussions on, we had a book about technology and social media, and we used it in one of our book discussions, and the students absolutely loved using it. You know, because they sat here with their smartphones voting on, you know, how do you use social media and your privacy settings on Facebook, and they just thought that was wonderful. So it was really fun, and you can see how the voting is taking place on the screen and how, you know, the results. So that's another bonus of using Poll Everywhere.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a really great way to use Poll Everywhere, especially with something where students might want to be more anonymous, like their privacy settings and how they make use of social media. And as Kathleen mentioned, when I've worked with students using Poll Everywhere, they really do get excited when you can see the results appearing, or the results of the poll appearing online as they take place. So what I'd like to do, because it looks like quite a few of you have not worked with Poll Everywhere, is just attempt to show it to you by using the web browse feature here. So bear with me one moment, and I'm going to go ahead and go online. Okay, so we're not to YouTube yet. And here is Poll Everywhere, and the poll that I have created for our use today is how do you generally conduct polls as part of your teaching and learning activities? And then here you have the option show of hands, respond with flashcard numbers, ballots, student response systems, Poll Everywhere, and other. And you can submit your answers to this poll either by texting one of these codes. So for example, if you generally conduct polls as part of your teaching and learning activities, you can do that by texting this code 508711, or you can also submit responses at this URL, which is pollev.com/bwilks. So in order to submit responses to Poll Everywhere, students or participants in a particular activity have the option of either texting a code, like you see here on the left-hand side, to show their response, or submitting via a web page. And this is what the web page looks like. And if you want to give this a try, if you want to open up a window or pull out your mobile phone, that's great. You can respond. Let me jump back to this other tab. You can respond by texting a code, or you can also go to this URL, which is pollev.com/bwilks. All right, yay for Poll Everywhere. Somebody uses Poll Everywhere. Thank you. So this is really nice that you can see in real time when learners submit their responses. Okay, great. We have show of hands also. And so if you do have the time during this workshop to give this a try, I'll hop back here later on and we can see the results of our poll. So I think it's pretty cool to see live, and students, as Kathleen mentioned, really seem to enjoy that as well. I actually recently read on the ILLI listserv, however, that some teachers have had problems if they leave the responses open. So I think they've received maybe some unsettling or not quite so humorous comments, because you can use this with open-ended questions as well. So just keep your audience in mind when using Poll Everywhere. Okay, great. So thanks for your responses. And we have other. So I'm going to go back now, because whoops. Okay, and a couple of you just noted other as a way in which you like to give polls in your teaching and learning activities, and I'm wondering what those other methods are. Okay, and I do see that I think Freya is entering into the chat box. Okay, so mostly in online classes, the polling options below. So like the poll that we did at the beginning of this webinar, is that what you mean, Freya? Okay, great. Yes, that was my first time working with that particular polling option. And like Poll Everywhere, I think that that's really a nice option and that you can see the results of the poll immediately, and they're very easy to share. So taking a poll is, I think, a pretty simple way that you can gather more information about your learners and also to make them or to encourage them to participate in the learning activity and to make them aware of the fact that you're actually interested in their experiences or what they are learning at the particular point you take the poll. Okay, so these are just the slides that I had for Poll Everywhere. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about some other active learning techniques, and maybe we can have some more discussion about how many of you might, or how some of you might have learned some of these or used some of these active learning techniques, and then other active learning techniques that you found to be effective as well. So of course there are numerous active learning techniques that you can use in your teaching and learning activities. But what I've selected to highlight are those that we have used here at Egan and that have seemed to work effectively with students. So one of these particular active learning techniques is the Cephalonian method. And this was created, I think it's quite a few years ago, by librarians at Cardiff University. And with this particular method, learners are given prompts or planted questions that they are to ask later as part of a learning activity. So when students come to attend a particular class or session, then they would be given questions that they would then be asked to ask at a later part of the session. And this is generally used with library orientations, and we have used it here at UAS orientations in the past, and I've heard that it was actually quite successful and students really enjoyed participating in that way by asking the questions that they were given. So questions could be something like, how do I get help with my research? I think one question was, why are librarians so awesome? Where can I find articles on a topic? Things like that if you're in a more academic environment. So you could actually create the types of questions that you want to address as part of your session and then have the participants ask them just kind of to encourage some interaction. The next activity is the Think, Pair, Share activity. And I found that this is a nice way to kind of encourage students who might not contribute verbally that much to a class to start to take small steps toward making that type of contribution. With the Think, Pair, Share activity, it's really a nice way also to give learners the opportunity to first think about a question on their own before they are asked to share their response with the class. So in the Think, Pair, Share, students will be provided with a question to answer. And then given some time, maybe just a couple of minutes, to think about the question and maybe jot down some notes about it and really approach it thoughtfully on their own. Then explore the question with a partner. So here comes in the pair. So the students would pair up as part of this activity and discuss what they had already come up with on their own, and then finally share the response with the rest of the class. And I've used this with Okay, I can see my audio is sounding odd again. I didn't do anything different, so let me just move my mic around a little bit. Okay, does that sound better? Okay, great, thank you. So the Think, Pair, Share activities, I've actually been very happy with using in class. I've used this recently. Well, I'm trying to think of a more recent example, but at one point when I remember using it where the students were really engaged was when we were discussing evaluating information resources. And it was really nice to give them the opportunity to think about the particular topic before they were actually asked to share their thoughts with each other and then finally the class. So I really like that aspect of that particular activity. The jigsaw activity is also very popular in the academic setting, and I think it can be used really well in other settings too, when you have a longer article or document or even a video, I guess. And at this point of the jigsaw, each person or group of people would take responsibility for just part of an article or an essay or even watching a video, as I mentioned. And then they will report back to the group on their particular part of that work. So then each person in the group or each person in the class or learning activity doesn't have to read an entire article or essay, but they can still learn about the different aspects and points of the work through the discussion through the group discussion and of others reporting back on the various sections that they read and became familiar with. And a couple of more active learning techniques. The one-sentence summary. I just recently came across this activity, and it's basically like a shorter version of the one-minute paper. In the one-sentence summary, learners can state the basics of a particular topic or an answer to a question, who, what, where, when, why. And this resulting sentence can easily be shared verbally, and it can even be shared online as well. So the one-sentence summary is a really nice way to gauge learning, perhaps at mid-session of a learning activity. And it's also just a nice short way to get students thinking and then responding to a particular question or prompt. And then finally, the one-minute paper. I suspect that some of you have either written a one-minute paper or asked others to do a one-minute paper at some point or another. A one-minute paper is really great for assessment as well. A one-minute paper could answer questions such as, what questions do you still have? What was most memorable about the sessions? And just like with the one-sentence summary, this can also be useful for assessments as well. Okay, and I see in the chat box, do students come up with the summary or does the presenter? And is that for the one-sentence summary? Thanks for asking. And students would come up with the summary. So, for example, you could ask the question, So the instructor might ask a question like, have you used the cephalonian method? And if so, how? And then the student could respond, or the learner could respond in just one sentence to that particular question. So it would be the students that would come up with the summary, the one-sentence summary. Thanks for asking. Okay, and I'm going to talk now just a little bit about a couple of more active learning techniques, and then I'd like to have some more discussion, because I think we do have time, on active learning techniques that we're using in some of our different teaching and learning activities. So I couldn't go through active learning techniques, of course, without talking about games. And I have to admit that honestly, I don't use games that much in my own teaching and learning activities, but I definitely plan to do so after the session as a result of kind of looking into all of the different games that are available to support teaching and learning. So here at Egan Library, we have an open house every fall. And this past fall, one of our librarians did Library Jeopardy! So students would have to respond to questions at the end after they had gone through most all of the open house. Then they play a Jeopardy! Type game, answering basic questions about the use of library resources and services. So Jeopardy! Can be adapted to a lot of different contexts, I think. Also, bingo. So bingo can be adapted to meet different learning goals as well. So in the past year at the open house, we've also played Google search strategies bingo. So a Google search strategy would be demonstrated, and then whoever had the strategy listed on his or her bingo card, so like site:/.edu, for example, for domain searching, then the student could mark off that particular box on their bingo card. And that was really well received as well. So as I mentioned, games can really be adapted to a variety of context and learning outcomes. And I realized preparing for this webinar that there are so many freely available games, particularly using Flash, that you can adapt online. If you go to Super Teacher Tools, you can find several different games. This is where we got our Jeopardy! From. And then, of course, I'm sure you can come up with effective Google search terms to search for educational games online that you can adapt and use with your different teaching and learning activities. So I've actually gone through quite a few different examples of active learning techniques that you can integrate into your teaching and learning activities. And I would really like it if we could take the time to share some thoughts and experiences. First of all, if you have used any of these learning activities, and what were some situations when a particular activity was useful, and then maybe we could share some experiences with using some active learning techniques that might not have been as effective as we would have liked them to be as part of a teaching and learning activity. And so has anyone tried, and you could just raise your hand, or I think just starting to type in the chat box would be fine. Has anyone tried the Cephalonian method, so the method of kind of planting questions on learners that they will ask later on in the session? Okay, and I don't see anybody really responding to that just yet. Okay, here we go. Kathleen, we used it with, yes, new student orientation. And I think that's the optimal time to use the Cephalonian method, and I believe that's what it was originally designed for new student orientation. And that's an excellent point, Kathleen, about that's when students are kind of shy, and it really helps warm up the students, and they can even get some laughs out of it, right, as they start making new friends and becoming familiar with their new surroundings. And so thanks for the question about how do they receive the questions. The questions can just, well, here we go. Thanks, Kathleen. So you can see that Kathleen's responding in the chat box.
Well, and sometimes the students kind of mumble and giggle, but it all adds to the charm of the whole thing.
That is the charm of student orientation overall too, right?
Right.
The laughing and giggling, yes. And that's great. It's kind of luring them out of their comfort zone maybe a little bit, but not too much, because they don't have to think of the question to answer, and everybody else knows that the question was planted on them anyway.
Exactly.
And I'm wondering about some of the other learning activities or active learning techniques that I've mentioned. Are there any that you've used effectively before, or maybe even not so effectively?
Hi, this is Julie, and I was recently at a training in Anchorage, and we used the jigsaw method, and we used it to have participants explore this very complicated website in depth, and it was pretty successful. It was great, actually.
Okay, excellent. And I think that it's a great point, Julie, that you explored a complicated website. So the jigsaw technique, I think, is very useful when you are exploring a more complicated work, website, or journal article.
The participants were very eager to share all of the ways the website was useful and not so useful, which was something we weren't really anticipating. So it kind of brought some more material to light than we had even expected.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks, Freya. I see Freya just entered in the chat box about using bingo with a French group, and it was very popular, but I think we went too long. Yeah, better for occasional use. Great. Well, thanks for sharing your experiences with these different active learning techniques. And I hope that you'll give at least one or two of them a try in the future as you think is appropriate to integrate into some of your teaching and learning activities. I'm looking forward to working with some games myself. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about teaching style and how your teaching style can influence the engagement, of course, of your learners. So it should go without saying that everyone has his or her own teaching style. So maybe you're just beginning to teach and are finding your own groove or style, but I think we have some very experienced librarians and teachers here who might feel very comfortable with their style. And in my opinion, it's best to go with your natural personality when you're teaching, just in terms of being genuine and open, because your learners will pick up on it. But at the same time, it can often be a challenge, of course, to put yourself out there, particularly if you are not used to teaching. Perhaps you're used to teaching online, and it's kind of a challenge to transition to the face-to-face environment, or vice versa, because it can be a challenge to really put yourself out there. But remember that it's really important that you recognize that you do have information to be shared, and that in order to share this information, it's necessary to kind of function as a teacher. Teaching is different than presenting. And this is something I think about quite a bit, especially when I have to present. When you're presenting, you're communicating just one way with your audience, right? You're just providing them with information. And when you're presenting, to me it seems like you're expected to be charming, funny, and interesting. As a teacher, you're having a type of conversation with your learners. You're asking and responding questions and observations and adjusting as needed while you cover your material. So it's not just one planned lecture or presentation that's just going to go from start to finish and that's it, while you are being charming, funny, and interesting. While you are working with your teaching style, or with teaching, I encourage you to kind of keep those things in mind about the difference between teaching and presenting. So as a teacher, you might not need to be charming, but we should all at least strive to be interesting. Now, something that's been written a lot about recently, it seems like, in library literature is using humor in your instruction. So you might want to give a shot at being funny, or at least trying. But if you aren't comfortable telling jokes or making puns, you might want to consider including funny graphics or videos in your activity. And there's a really important quote, I think, about humor in teaching. And for it to be effective, and this is a quote by Garner, I have the reference at the end of my presentation. For humor to be effective, it needs to be specific, targeted, and appropriate to the subject matter. So making a totally unrelated joke, comment, or wisecrack might get learners' attention, but it might not be necessarily get their attention in a positive way, and it might not support the aim of the learning activity. So I like to remind myself sometimes about trying to include funny graphics or funny videos in activities, and sometimes I learn that what I think is funny, the students don't necessarily think is funny, but they seem to appreciate if you give it a shot at least. So I'd like to share just a really short video clip that I came across recently and used in one of my classes, and I was really surprised with how many chuckles it got and actually how many students liked the show The Office as well. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share that clip with you. Okay, so we should be on YouTube now, and this is Michael Scott Loves Wikipedia. Oh, I wonder if you can hear the sound though. Okay, so I guess you weren't able to hear the sound to that. And yes, I will send you the link. Thanks, Darcy. Just give me 1 minute. I think it's pretty funny, but I'm an Office fan. So I'm talking about the TV show, The Office. And Michael Scott has a really nice 40 seconds about how he loves Wikipedia. So just give me 1 moment, please. I'm trying to get the URL. Okay, so there's a link if you do want to take a look at that short little clip later on. And really I was just showing an example of something that's humorous that definitely can support a learning activity. I use this, of course, when we're talking about Wikipedia and when it's appropriate to use Wikipedia, not to use Wikipedia in the academic environment, and evaluating information resources. And the last point I would like to make about integrating teaching and learning activities, let's see here. Okay, sorry. Integrating teaching and learning activities is that it's important to be responsive to the learners who are in your session. So there's really not much of a point to including active learning activities in your sessions if you aren't going to actually respond to the learners and work from those active learning techniques as you go through the session. So it's really important to respond to questions when you are able to, adjust the discussion as needed, and also to remember to remain flexible and to actually be engaged yourself. Because as we all know, learners pick up on that if you are not engaged yourself with the material and also with them. So I just have a super short recap here. So of course it's important, as we all know, to make a plan for your session and your learning activity. And within that plan, really think about the strategies that you are going to use to engage learners throughout your activity. Also, do your best to help your learners reach those learning outcomes that you put forth when you're actually developing your session. And then choose from the many different active learning techniques that are available in order to encourage engagement and help your students reach those learning outcomes that you have put forth for your activity. So I really encourage you to investigate active learning techniques further if this is something that you're interested in. And it would be great if we could share at some point what we find with each other. And I really like hearing about what other people do in their teaching and learning activities and what works and what doesn't work and how that specifically links to engagement. Because our engaged learners will be learners who retain the information and make use of it, I really believe, more for lifelong learning in addition to their academic pursuits. And I'm talking, of course, particularly from the academic environment, but I do think it's really important for students to make that link between what they're learning in their academic exposure and how they can make use of that in their daily lives and also after they leave the academic environment. So we have just a few more minutes for questions, comments. I really appreciate you taking the time to come to this webinar today, and I've really enjoyed the comments and some of the discussion that we've had already. So do you have any questions for me or anything else that you want to put out there about engaging learners?
Thank you so much, Bethany, for doing this. I really appreciate it. And if anybody has tips for engaging learners online, I would really appreciate them because I'm kind of at a loss.
Thanks, Kathleen. And yes, I would appreciate those tips as well.
But I think I will do more polling. You've reminded me that if I can poll here in the library, I can poll using the polling feature here on Collaborate, and you've reminded me of that. So thank you.
Oh, great, good. Well, I'm glad. And also, I think that videos oftentimes are a good way to kind of encourage more engagement online, like by showing short video clips or kind of including some how-to videos. And even if students can make and post their own videos, sometimes that might not necessarily work with kind of a one-shot webinar such as this. But in a class where you meet more than once, I think that watching and sharing with videos can be helpful and engaging. I've received some positive comments about that recently that frankly I was kind of surprised about.
Bethany, I just wanted to remind your participants that when they exit, they should automatically go to your survey. So they don't have to copy the URL. When they close out Blackboard, it should take them there automatically.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Julie. Okay, and it looks like there are no additional questions or comments. So again, thank you all so much for attending the webinar this morning. This has been fun, and I hope to see your names and faces in the near future. So have a great afternoon.